Hi, so welcome. My name is Dana Howarth. I'm the Deputy Director of the New Mexico Caregivers Coalition. I see lots of new faces, so I'm super excited about that. Welcome everyone for joining us today. This is our second session in our March Dementia series. So I hope everyone is looking forward to lots of information. I did send out an email a little while ago that had lots of handouts that our guest presenter, Julie Rivers, wanted everyone to have, so you had your own copies. If you didn't get them open, don't worry, it was your option, but that way you have them afterwards since there's so much information that's going to come out of today's session. Before we get started, just a few little housekeeping. We ask that everyone keeps themselves on mute during the session. It helps limit the background noise on the recording. It also helps kind of keep down distractions going on. The live transcription, closed captioning is running. If you need that, if you prefer to turn that off, you can do so by going to the More button, the More menu, and it'll tell you hide subtitle, and you can turn it off if you don't want to have that running. But it is there for folks that would prefer to have it on. We are going to be holding today's session. The presenter, Julie, is going to speak present her information first, and then there'll be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So if you have questions that come up during the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat. And then when the Q&A session starts, we will go through the chat and read those questions out to our presenter, and then she'll have a chance to answer them. Before we get started, I want to just do a quick introduction of the New Mexico Caregivers Coalition. So we are a small nonprofit in the state of New Mexico that provides training, classes, resources to family caregivers, paid professional care workers, and their care recipients throughout the state of New Mexico and parts of Arizona on the Navajo Nation. So folks of you that may be joining us from the Navajo Nation may know one of our partners, Valerie Sosi. If you want to say hi real fast.
Hi, everybody. I'm glad you guys were able to connect with us and ask all your questions. We have our wonderful professionals today. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. I also have my coworker, Bridget Cobb, who's here helping me monitor the chat. So if anyone has any questions or has any Zoom issues, feel free to direct message Bridget and she can help walk you through that. Do you want to say hi real fast?
Hi real fast. Glad everybody could make it.
Thank you. I will also be monitoring the chat. So like I said, feel free to write your questions in the chat. If you haven't already said hi in the chat, please do so. Valerie and I are taking attendance to make sure everyone gets credit for being in today's class. You will get a certificate at the end of all 4 dementia sessions. You're not required to attend all 4, but we will maybe not be sending certificates out until then. So make sure that we can see your name, whether you put it in the chat or it's on your screen. That way we know you're here. So thank you all. And I'm going to now pass the presentation on to our guest speakers. First, I'm going to bring in Ruth Dennis, and then I'll let her introduce who she brought with her today. You're on mute, Ruth.
I keep forgetting to mute today, or keep forgetting to put myself up today. I apologize. I'm Ruth Dennis. I'm Director of Education and Social Services for Vista Living. I've been working with the Caregiver Coalition for, I think this is my 3rd or 4th quarterly set to try to get education out there. Today I have the honor of introducing Julie Rivers, who's a friend of mine and a really sharp attorney, and does, in my experience with her, does really good work with really complicated stuff. So it's a pleasure to introduce you, and I will let you get started, Julie. Julie, also, one thing I have to put out there, has experience with Alzheimer's as a family caregiver and daughter. There's a heart and soul to this too.
Yeah. Oh, didn't expect that. Yeah, my mom died of Alzheimer's back in October of 2021, and was diagnosed approximately 10 years before that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share the screen, and I'm going to take you through. And the reason I want to take in questions, otherwise we'd be here all night because I love taking questions and doing all that. But I want to, for those of you who are on a really limited schedule, I want to be able to fly through these materials. The things that I'm going to actually refer to in this presentation today are two things. One is obviously the PowerPoint that was included as a PDF for you. And then the other document that I'll kind of flip through is called the data needed in the black box. So those are the two things I'm going to really focus on. I also, if you would like, I can put in the chat my email so that if you have, if we can't get to a question that's a burning question, I have kind of as a lawyer, I have kind of this narrow window where I can educate, but I can't give legal advice. So, but I'm certainly more than happy to provide resources, though I think Ruth and this coalition are probably able to provide much more than I could, but I'm certainly happy to put my email address in. Do you want me to do that? Just do this if that's the answer. Okay, let me do it real quick, and then that way you'll have it. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do a share screen and put the presentation up in the share. Let me get this to, I hate it when it does this. There we go. Slideshow from beginning. There we go. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk today about what a fiduciary does and what those documents are. And the first question might be, what's a fiduciary? I thought we were talking about powers of attorney and all of that. Well, actually, that is what a fiduciary is. It is, just think of a fiduciary as an umbrella. And under that umbrella are certain types of fiduciaries. And fiduciaries are those that stand in our shoes when we're not able to take care of matters for ourselves. So if you have a financial power of attorney, which we'll talk about today, then that financial power of attorney would come under the umbrella of fiduciary. The healthcare power of attorney comes under that. A will, if you have a will, there would be a personal representative, or sometimes people have used the term executor or PR. That would be a different type of fiduciary. And then, of course, you have the trustee, who is also a fiduciary. So with that, let's talk about being a fiduciary. And if some of you have already started doing that role, then you probably understand exactly the look on this woman's face. So these are the top 10 things to keep in mind. Always call a lawyer, even if it's just for a brief consultation to gather some information, sort of like what I'm doing today. It's worth it because
Julie,
yeah.
we're not seeing your screen yet. We're still seeing the introduction slide. You haven't pushed
Nope. I'm on the fourth slide in.
Oh dear. Well, I think you need to do play slide or something like that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, you may want to stop the share and then reshare. It's like frozen on the
Frozen on the
PowerPoint.
first. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let me see if that works. Thanks. Okay. All right, let me try this. All right, are we there?
10 things you should
10
know.
things to know? Okay. It must not have flipped when it switched to a slideshow, it didn't flip. So, okay. So basically, call a lawyer. You want to avoid conflicts of interest, which we'll talk about in a second. Your job is to protect the property if you're doing the financial side. And the only one that is not a financial power of attorney is the healthcare power of attorney, and something else called a surrogacy, which we'll talk about briefly. You pay the expenses, the taxes, the insurance. If you can find a better deal, then do it. You're supposed to use good care and prudence in working with somebody else's finances. If you're making distributions to a beneficiary and a trustee, or if it's a trust, or on behalf of the principal, and the principal is the person who created the power of attorney. You have to keep good records. You report as required, and there's really not that much of a reporting requirement unless it's a trust. And we're not going to really talk about trusts today, but at the very end of the presentation, I'm going to hit a few slides on that. Compensation we'll briefly talk about as well. You want to keep track of your time. Even if you choose to waive that time, if you end up, say you're the caregiver and then the person you've been caregiving for has passed, and now your siblings are causing all sorts of trouble, that's the time to be able to say, here are my records and I would like to get paid for all this service that I've done over the last 3 years. Because then they start to see that it wasn't something in the back of their mind of, well, at least I'm not having to do it. It's actually being kept track of. And then, of course, if you have any of these documents we're going to talk about today that give you the power to act, read the document. And if you want, that again goes back to number one, which is to call and talk with the lawyer and have that lawyer read it through before meeting with you, so that both you and that lawyer can really know what that document's about, because you don't want to get yourself in hot water if you don't have to. And let's see, there we go. So your general duties, and this is the duty of impartiality. You've got to operate on the benefit of the beneficiaries. You can't give one beneficiary something unless that's exactly what it says to do in the document. But if you're just doing a general distribution of some sort, it needs to go impartially to all of them. There can't be a conflict of interest. That means your loyalty has to be to the person you're serving. And you administer the estate, which, by the way, an estate we have just walking around. We always think of that as what happens when we die, but the estate is actually in place today. So your checking account, your car, your house, whatever is in that is your estate even today. So when you're serving as a financial power of attorney for someone, then you're managing their estate. And then, of course, after they die, you then are managing their estate again. And the same is, of course, true with the trust. So the next thing to keep in mind is if you have any sort of special skills or expertise, you are expected to use them. So it can be held against you if you did not. So if you are a financial advisor and you came into this role and were serving as a financial power of attorney, you would be expected to use those skills and expertise that you have to be able to manage that estate. That may have been why you were actually selected. And so, as I said a minute ago, these are the fiduciaries we're talking about today. The trustee, very briefly, the financial power of attorney, the healthcare power of attorney, and or the surrogate. And so the thing is, we have to talk about what are we going to do when we're talking about, we're going to talk of the body first. So of the body would be the healthcare power of attorney. And there's one that's lesser known that New Mexico is actually pretty unique for, and that's the mental health care power of attorney. So if you have somebody who is younger, who is not, an elder, that this is not an issue for them, then it's treated separately. And as a result, we have, as you can see here, special forms available. You can probably Google and get the mental health care treatment decisions form, which is pretty extensive. When I talk with lawyers, about estate planning issues, a lot of times they're not even aware of this wonderful feature that New Mexico law has. It does take time to fill it out because it's real value laden. There's a lot of stuff in this form that is helpful. For example, if the person who has a mental health issue is in need of this form, they've got to think about what is it that triggers them. What do they look like when they start having a mental health episode? And they need to be able to describe that in the form, along with the type of actions they want and how they want to be treated during the time they may be incapacitated. So this is about protecting the person. And I want to tell you a story first, and this will kind of lead into the rest of it. Make sure I have my phone handy so I'm paying attention to the time. So I have a friend named Debbie, and that's of course not her name. She knows I tell this story. And a few years ago, she called me on a Sunday afternoon on a beautiful day like today. And she said, I think I need to go to the emergency room. Can you come get me? Now, Debbie is a PhD and is was a professional here in town. She's now retired and she's in good health. The story is not about her health, but it gives a good example of how a healthcare power of attorney works. And that's what we're going to be talking about. So I picked Deb up about 20 minutes later. By that time, she's gray, she's shuffling, and she can't put two words together. We get her to the hospital emergency room. They start her on fluids. She starts to perk back up. And I said, Deb, I need to know who your healthcare powers of attorney are. And I'm hoping like heck she's got some. And do you have a form? She said, yes, I did it about 4 years ago. And I said, well, who's the first one listed? Oh, she died. Who's the second one listed? She's in a dementia ward. Who's the third one listed? Oh, she got married and moved to South Dakota. And I said, well, Miss South Dakota it is until I can redo your form and we can put local people and take care of it that way. So that's what we did. Now, Debbie was a sick girl. She was in ICU for about 10 days. She was then in medium ICU for about 10 days. And then she also ended up with on the regular floor for a few more days after that. So this is the thing. We had to get together a group. Ruth and I were talking beforehand. Deb was a single gal. And so she had single friends. And so there were four of us that got together, and we got together for lunch to figure out how are we going to help in working as an agent for Debbie. And this is the thing that we learned. And then I'm going to go back and pick up the piece of how are we going to help Debbie. What we learned is, everybody thinks, I don't want to have that Terry Chavo thing happen to me. I don't want to be in a perpetual vegetative state. That's what people think the healthcare agency is about. It's not. That's 1%. The other 99% are all the gray area decisions that have to be made, that you have to make when they're not able to make the decision for themselves. And keep in mind that we go in and out of capacity. It's not, sometimes it's really black and white, and sometimes it's not. And so when we're in that kind of weird state of have capacity, don't have capacity, then you're constantly having to work in that shifting sand when you're advocating for the person, for the patient. So one of the things we had to do, because what I want you to keep in mind is that this is about values. And I'm going to talk about that here in a second as well. But I want you to see this. This is, dang it, I just went out. Okay, give me 1 second. I don't know how I did that, but I did. So, okay. All right, let me do a stop share and then go back in. Wait 1 second. So Atul Gawande wrote a book called Being Mortal. And this is where you want to start writing. Being Mortal is also a frontline special that you can find on pbs.org. Look up Frontline, look up Being Mortal, or you can look up Atul Gawande's name, and that will bring up the one or so special. So the thing is, we have sort of an old-fashioned idea about how we should care for people in the last chapter of their lives, not considering necessarily their priorities and what's important to them, but instead considering their safety. And so Atul Gawande is about refashioning all that and coming up with a different way so that people can use a different approach towards working with those that are in the last chapter of their lives. So, as I said, come on. It did it again. I don't know why it's doing that. Give me 1 second. Okay, let me try this. There we go. The thing that's different with this particular healthcare power of attorney than the others is that we have to consider their values. I'm going to go back to that lunch that I was having with those 4 women when we're trying to take care of Debbie and we're figuring out how we're going to do that. What we're having to do is figure out what are Deb's values around her healthcare, what's important to her and what's not. And so one of the things that comes out is making sure that you know what those values are before you start making decisions. And if you don't, then you just have to do a guess. So there is a, I don't know why we're doing this either. Okay, give me 1 second. There we go. There is a form called the 5 Wishes. So after you watch the Frontline special on pbs.org, about 7 minutes from the end of that special are several questions that Atul Gawande asks. Write those down because those are your launch pad to be able to start making decisions about your own values. Once you kind of rounded that out a little bit, then you can go just Google 5wishes.org and you will get this form. You pay like $5 for it. And that can serve as a healthcare power of attorney if there's nothing else. And you see here that there are 5 wishes that are listed. And in that, it really starts to kind of unpack what your values are and what's important to you, because that's where it's at. It can be even as simple as something like, don't have the TV on in my hospital room. I don't want to listen to commercials. So, for example, that's what mine says. So you can also, and I usually use the 2 together. I use this healthcare power of attorney, and then I attach the 5 wishes for the clients who want to use it as an Exhibit A. So, and I've started including certain language in regards to COVID in my healthcare power of attorney. I've also started including language that talks about call hospice as soon as possible, because that makes such a huge difference, as I'm sure some of you know. And so now, what if we don't have a healthcare power of attorney? And this started coming up, especially around COVID. And a couple of years ago, I got my first call right after COVID started. And the person, the patient had COVID and ultimately died of it and did not have any healthcare paperwork. However, New Mexico has kind of an out. It's called a surrogate. And if you look, because in New Mexico, if you are not able to do a form and fill it out, you can, from your hospital bed, designate someone to serve as your agent. And if you have that information, it can be helpful especially if they're being moved to a facility, a skilled nursing facility after being in the hospital, if you go ahead and complete the surrogacy forms. And you will see that in the packet of information. There's 2 documents. One is the declaration and one is the acceptance of serving as a surrogate. And that way you at least have some sort of healthcare form. This is the downside to that surrogacy approach, because in the healthcare power of attorney, I embed the HIPAA release. Now, how do they get around the HIPAA release? They get around that by talking with the patient right there as if the patient were receiving the information. However, it does place the medical personnel at risk by doing that. And so if you have a healthcare power of attorney, your next question is always, we need a HIPAA release. One can't happen without the other, without some problems. So you'll want to make sure you have that. And so we also have in New Mexico, of course, you hear about the DNR. There is not a whole heck of a lot of law on the DNR in New Mexico. If you're interested in the form and the information that I have, feel free to email me and I'll be glad to send you the DNR, the whole DNR packet that I give to my clients. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on. Let me see. I wanted to make sure. Oh, right to die. I did want to talk about that real quickly, because you're probably going, well, she didn't talk about right to die. Well, that's because I gave you documents about right to die. They can't be in your estate planning documents if you do not have the ability to move forward on your own, because you don't have the cognitive ability, or you're under a lot of medication and don't have capacity for a lot of different reasons. You can't do a right to die. And so there is only a limited place in the law where right to die fits, and you can certainly review that information based upon the 4-page handout I gave you about right to die along with the form. So let's go on and talk about financial power of attorney. That's also called a durable power of attorney. Durable just means it doesn't terminate when somebody becomes incapacitated. It remains and endures beyond that. And so one of the things we're going to talk about is digital assets and how we get things together. This works kind of in a twofold fashion. One, this is information if you're serving in the agency role that you will need to get together in order to know that you've gotten all the information. One of the documents that you have is the one I said that you'll want to have out is the data needed in the black box, which we're going to talk about here in a second. The zombie debt is actually a real thing. Federal Trade Commission coined that phrase, and this is how it works. So when we pass, at that point, fraudsters, and even during an extended period, the fraudsters can start creating a whole new identity using the information of the incapacitated or the deceased. And they create a whole new set of debt. So what we want to do, and part of the thing that we're responsible for doing, is making sure that we have the data needed for closing down accounts. And so that data that's needed is going to be in the black box. And so when you pull out that black box data needed that I gave you, and it's just a form, it's a place to start.
Julie, you're getting an echo.
I don't think I am. I think somebody has not muted. Can you hear me okay now? Okay. So the data needed in the black box you'll find in that form that is just a starting point. And it kind of lets you know, oh, this is the stuff I have to get together. It also helps you if you're stuck flat-footed with having to get together all this information. and you don't even know where to start. This is a good starting point of the data you need to get. All of the income, all of the expenses, the liabilities, the assets. And one of the things that comes out is you're going to want to make sure and include, if you're actually doing your own black box, the contact people who can help, who waters the plants, who makes sure that who's the vet for the pets. That kind of information becomes very helpful for anybody serving in the stepping into your shoes. And if you are the one that's had to step into shoes, this is how you can put it together. So let's see. One of the things I want to bring out, because I'm seeing that this is an area that a lot of people do not know about, and it provides such great relief. I was talking to my dad the other day, and I said, do you have your DD 214? And he's like, my what? And he's a veteran. He did not serve during wartime, but he was a veteran. And I said, sometimes is information on that DD 214, and that's the exit document when you leave the military. And finding that document is imperative, because first of all, if it's during somebody's lifetime or even shortly after their death, at the very bottom of the document, not all the time, but sometimes somebody has elected to have a little bit of life insurance, and they're able to do that when they're exiting from the military. I had a fellow literally just last Friday that I saw who was a veteran, and I said, I need you to pull your DD 214. Oh, I know what it says. And I said, I want you to look at the bottom and see if there's any life insurance. And he said, I don't think there is. And I said, I don't care, just do it anyway. And he did. He calls me back. He says, oh my God, I have $10,000 of life insurance I didn't know I had. And about half the time, that's what happens. So pulling that DD 214 is helpful. Also, and keep in mind, when I use the word VA pension, or that phrase, we are not, talking about a retirement pension. It is unfortunate. That's what they named it, but that's what the VA named it. And just know that that's all that is a way to get some resources when you need them. So first and foremost, you have to, if this is before 1980, you have to have served 90 days of active service. And you have to have 1 day during wartime. So you could be serving in Fort Hood in Texas, pushing paperwork, or your spouse has, and you're doing that during 1 day of wartime. So if you, let's say you entered the military the day before the Vietnam War ended, that would be 1 day of wartime. And then if you continue to serve for another 90 days, and of course you have, have been honorably discharged, then you are eligible for these services. Be buried in a national cemetery. That's always available. The other three are needs-based: service pension, household allowance, and aid and attendance allowance. However, if you are dealing with, and it doesn't have to be a military-related illness, if you are dealing with having some problems with resources, this may be helpful. And so where do you even begin to start? You're probably asking that question. Well, that's great. This lawyer's telling me this, but what am I supposed to do with this information? Well, first, see if you can find the DD 214. And I can't get you around having to probably end up calling the VA and waiting on the phone for several hours. But what I can tell you is when you have that, then at that point, you may use that to then go to the American Legion or the VFW, because there's always the guy who knows all about the VA pension and will be able to help you and take you through what you need to know. And so you don't have to use a lawyer for this, but it's not for the faint of heart. So my suggestion is go to the VFW, go to the American Legion, find out who the guy is, and they'll be able to help you with those last 3 bullet points that I'm talking about. The National Cemetery, you can take care of that during lifetime. And if that make it and keep in mind, this also applies to this, all this applies to the spouse. So if you're taking care of someone whose spouse was in the military and has passed on, they may still be available. So make sure you don't lose that slide and follow up on the outside chance this might be extremely helpful for you. And so let's talk about what digital assets are. And the easiest way to talk about digital assets is any sort of log information that you use. For example, you have a bank account, and if you're not looking at my screen right now, you might want to look at the screen. So you've got a bank account. The portal into that bank account, here's the bank account. Portal into that bank account is a digital asset. It has a username and a passcode with it. Every bit of logon information, and if you look at my phone, for example, let me see if I can get it up here. 1 second. You'll see on the phone that I have all these icons. All those icons on our phones and on our iPads and on our computers have username and passcodes associated with it. And if it's not written down somewhere, we're not going to, somebody stepping into your shoes is not going to know how to get them. So let's talk about what some of these are. In particular, keep in mind that Amazon, Netflix, Hulu, all of those are digital assets. Airline companies, Southwest Airlines, unless that's changed more recently, you can port those miles upon death. So you want to make sure that that Southwest is notified and that all these other companies are notified as well. And so one of the things that came about, this is all because of a Digital Assets Act called RFADA, and the fiduciary cannot impersonate the user. And that's what we used to do back in before January 1st of 2018, is that we just say, well, just go in. If you have your mom's login information, just log in so you can manage the account. Well, you can't do that anymore. And then, of course, you have the terms of service agreements. And those are long, and we hit I accept, and we never read them. And so keep in mind that if you're serving as a have a power of attorney, a financial power of attorney, and you're serving in the role of agent, if there's information in that power of attorney that says that you are to manage digital assets, that means you have to read these things, believe it or not, because they supersede any sort of appointment made in the document itself. And you're like, well, then what's the point? Well, there are some points, and I'm not going to get into those fine points today. So you want to make sure, of course, you have these passwords in a safe place. Remember, we were talking about that black box. All this goes in your black box. And so you're going to have all of the data that we talked about in regards to assets, liabilities, income, expenses. And then you're also going to have passwords for all of your username, all your usernames and passcodes for everything. And then if you update it, make sure that you just, throw a sticky in there until you update it the next year, because you'll want to update this once a year. And so you don't want to keep all this, of course, at home unless you have a non-movable fire safe. That's what safe deposit boxes are for. They're not all that expensive. It's important to get one. And so the duties are the same for somebody, for digital assets as they are for the other duties we talked about early on. So you can use a power of attorney for pretty much anything except for the things we have listed here. Obviously, if you have a healthcare power of attorney, that's why we have a separate power of attorney. You can't have a financial power of attorney also designating healthcare. And so these are the things that they cannot do. And you're like, well, I don't have to worry about this because, my grandmother has a trust. And so I don't care about the financial power of attorney because she's got that trust. Oh, think again, because there are certain things that a power of attorney, and these are also true for the person who would serve as personal representative or executor upon somebody's death. These are the same things they would be doing. And that is they can sign tax returns because a trustee cannot except for a trust return. If somebody is incapacitated, you can put everything into the trust. It's called funding. And then you can file a lawsuit on behalf of the person if needed. So if you have co-ages, sometimes people do that and they say, oh, I want both my kids to serve. They automatically operate independently. So if you want them to serve jointly, if that's part of what you're dealing with, that's a problem. If one's writing checks and you're writing checks, so you want to make sure you all are on the same page. And then reasonable compensation under the circumstances. So what does that mean? And I'll talk about that. I keep promising I'll talk about it, but I will. So here are the duties, and they're pretty significant. Of course, you have to act in good faith, that duty of loyalty and care, confidence, and diligence, cooperation with the healthcare power of attorney, and of course, preserving the estate plan on behalf of the person you're serving. And if there are other duties that you want to make sure that are covered, then you have to state them specifically, like we were talking about the digital assets. That's a good example. That's the problem with the statutory forms that we have here in New Mexico. It doesn't have digital assets language, and also it doesn't have specifically, it doesn't make it clear that these are the things that have to have special language in the power of attorney, financial power of attorney, for it to take effect. So these things right here would have to be specifically noted, along with the digital assets we just talked about. And otherwise, it's fairly broad. The language in the statutory form and the forms that I use, I have pretty broad language. And your duty, one of them, is to maintain the standard of living. Now, if they're living beyond their means, obviously that can't happen. But if there is a way to do that on the behalf of the principal, the person you're serving, this is then you have to take into account anybody who's also dependent on them. And that may even include paying child support. And I want to bring up one little piece of information because this becomes really important. If you are thrown in the role of financial power of attorney, make sure the long-term care policy premium is paid, and make sure that you consult with a long-term care consultant, the life insurance or long-term care. Make sure you consult with that agent or consultant, because that can provide all sorts of benefits that you may not be aware of otherwise. And then you also, it's like if you breach your duty in regards to this, in regards to power of attorney and the financial piece, you may be on the hook. And not only are you on the hook for the property, you're also on the hook for attorney fees and costs paid on the behalf. Anybody can rely on the financial power of attorney. There's no reason not to. There are problems with certain national banks that make it extremely difficult. If you end up having to work with a national bank, call a lawyer, because they make it extremely difficult to, in regards to honoring these powers of attorney, even though they're effective. So that gets us, what time is it? I'm doing okay. Gets us to the compensation question. And that is, what is it? And how much do you get? And of course, you know, we get to the end, you're like, Julie, you better have a better answer than no guidance under New Mexico law. This is the thing to keep in mind, that a lot of times, if I have somebody who, let's say they make $25 an hour, then more than likely that's what we're going to charge for compensation for the agent is the $25 an hour. If on the other hand, they are a high income earner, we're not going to be charging that rate for purposes of reasonable compensation. What I typically do in that instance is I look at some of the professional fiduciaries that serve and then charge about 80 to 85% of what they charge. And you're like, well, wait a minute, but I'm still doing the same thing. Yeah, but you're not doing it as efficiently because you're not doing quite a few cases all at the same time and have kind of a system so that you can do it quicker. So that's pretty much kind of the method that we use. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to the trustee. And as you can see, it says hire professionals. So when you get into a trust, the first thing you want to do is call your lawyer. This is not, you do not go into this good night alone. I have a case right now where a couple of ladies did a lovely job of maintaining the property since their mother's death in the late 2000s. And yet they'd never filed a tax return. They never accounted to the other beneficiaries. They didn't go ahead and sell the property as they probably should have. And so now we're having to deal with it 12 years later, and it's quite a challenge. And it wasn't that they had engaged in malfeasance. They hadn't, but they had not engaged a CPA. They hadn't consulted with a lawyer. They didn't know what steps they were supposed to do, because once the person who has the trust dies, it's its own separate entity. And at that point, it gets its own separate tax ID number, and you have to file tax returns on behalf of the trust every year. So you want to make sure, of course, that you have a copy of the trust so you know what you're responsible for under the trust. And you can only manage what's in that container called the trust. So, for example, when they signed the document, the trust document way back when, at that time, we may have done a deed that placed the house in the name of the trust. So if you don't have it that way, if there's nothing that's been funded into the trust, that's what that's called, then usually you have something called a pour over will, where literally all the assets pour over from into the trust upon death, but you have to go through a probate first to make that happen. And probates are not that big a deal in New Mexico. They can be, but most of the time they are not. But keep in mind that the trustee can only manage what's in there. And if there's nothing in there, there's nothing to manage. And so at that point, the personal representative or executor would, if this is after death, would then be transferring the assets over into the trust as the probate progresses. So the trustee has a lot of headaches. They have accounting they have to do, which is basically letting the beneficiaries know what's what. They have to manage all the assets and investments and real estate. They have to make sure the taxes are filed, like we talked about a minute ago, and they have to do distributions. And if the trustee fails to exercise this care and skill, then at that point, they can be liable. Notice it says for any reason. It doesn't say, oh, if I screwed up, I didn't know any better. That's why it's really important to have professionals on board if you're dealing with a trust. And the biggest headache for all trustees is the beneficiary, because it's like feeding hungry cats, and it's really, really can be a challenge. So that kind of takes you through in really short order what a power of attorney does on the financial side, on the healthcare side, what your options are in regards to if you don't have a healthcare power of attorney, the use of possibly a surrogacy form, and then, of course, just briefly what it means to serve as a trustee. So with that, I can open up. I'm going to stop the share, and we can open up for questions.
I think it's noteworthy to say that everybody should be aware that if you're in Arizona and then you're trying to get a New Mexico lawyer, that's not gonna help you any. And vice versa. If you're in New Mexico and you're trying to get an Arizona lawyer, that's not gonna help you either. So make sure you have the correct lawyer for your state. For Navajo, it is like that. So just be aware that you're with the right state, because even for power of attorney, I've run into so many different issues, and we're just right there with the border. You kind of think they would understand, but they don't. So just make sure that when you're doing this too, that you're with the right state, and I know we go back and forth too. We sometimes we go to Phoenix, then we go to Albuquerque, and then we go back to Albuquerque again, then we go back to Phoenix. So just be aware of the state's guidelines.
Thank you for that, Valerie. She's right.
Before we go into some Q&A, because I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to ask their questions. For folks that do need to leave, because it is almost 4:30, you are welcome to leave if you're not planning on asking questions. We are going to stay past 4:30 to answer any questions that folks have. But I do know that some folks may have other obligations and might need to leave. So don't feel like you're being rude if you need to leave, and just close your session for yourself. But we are going to stay on for a little bit and let anyone who has questions join. And so floor is open to anyone that is going to stay for Q&A. If anyone has a question, you're welcome to just unmute yourself.
And I actually
have a question. The power of attorney for the state and the Navajo reservation, is that different?
Yes, it would be different, mainly because they are different sovereign. I mean, Navajo is a sovereign nation, so it would have its own power of attorney, and they do have their own sets of laws that are to be followed. If you're in New Mexico, there's a certain power of attorney. If there is a power of attorney, Arizona would have its own set of laws, or any state for that matter, or sovereign nation. However, they are, if you are a resident of New Mexico and you go to, I don't know, the state of Washington, then it will be honored there, the power of attorney would.
Okay.
Ruth?
my question is actually, if you're choosing someone as a power of attorney, should it be someone local or can it be someone out of state?
That's a great question. And so I'm going to talk about it both on the healthcare side and on the financial power of attorney side. On the financial power of attorney side, for the most part, they do not have to be local. But remember those black box items that we talked about. If you have all that data together for your financial power of attorney, then the power of attorney would be able to go, oh, I see that Susie Q is on here to take care of the plants. If somebody has an extended absence, I'll call Susie Q. And then that way you've got some boots on the ground, and you can also hire local people to help with that. On the healthcare side, with COVID, healthcare providers are much more comfortable with doing Zoom and FaceTime chats. However, remember we were talking about Debbie, and that a lot of it is advocacy. So having some boots on the ground so you can make sure they're getting bathed, because that was an issue with Debbie. I showed up and I said, you haven't bathed Debbie. And I said, tomorrow when I come back, she better be bathed. And she wasn't. It was about 8:30 at night. So literally I'm going into another person's hospital room and saying, I need to talk to the nurse right now, because you really have to be able to advocate and not let them get by with not taking care of the patient appropriately.
So I am hoping I have not made a bad mistake. When this happened, when my partner got diagnosed with Alzheimer's, I knew I needed a healthcare power of attorney and a financial power of attorney, and I didn't realize there were two different kinds. have had an awful time getting a lawyer. I have gone through a couple of lawyers and I'm having a really difficult time contacting somebody who can see me. I was able to download a power of attorney off the internet, and it was something called a springing power of attorney. Now I think I should have gotten a durable power of attorney, and I wonder how difficult it's going to be to swap one for the other without a lawyer, because I have not been able to contact a lawyer who can speak to me. And I also have a story about dealing with a national bank.
So when you're dealing, you have to understand that for a lot of us lawyers right now, just like everybody else in their different industries, if you call me, it's going to be probably around 3 weeks before I even can talk to you on the phone. And then it may be another 3 to 4 weeks before we actually have an appointment. And that's insane. And I know it. And I always have to apologize, but that's the way it is. And so it's nothing personal. It's just that, you know, it takes quite a bit of time. And it didn't used to be that way. It's just been that way in the last 6 to 9 months. And none of us know why, but it just is. In regards to the power of attorney, the question becomes not so much whether it's valid, but will they accept it? Because if the answer is they accept it, I understand there's a national bank issue, but if others are accepting it, they're protected under the law if you're stating that it's valid. Once somebody is completely and fully incapacitated, then at that point, they can't do a financial or a healthcare power of attorney. And you're left with doing what's called a guardianship and a conservatorship, which is expensive and a real pain. However, keep in mind that somebody who is in early stages of dementia, they go in and out of capacity. I have a case that from a couple of months ago where when the wife contacted me, she said, we're getting ready to put him into a facility and they want to make sure we have powers of attorney, but I don't know whether he can do it or not. He gets confused. We go through the whole thing. I don't have to go through that with you guys. Then at that point, I said, well, when's his next doctor's appointment? He may not have capacity to be able to sign a new will, but he may have capacity to be able to appoint powers of attorney. And so at that point, and I've had this on a couple of occasions where when the client presents, I know that they are not probably capable of doing will, but they can do powers of attorney, which can be so helpful. So if your sweetheart is in that position, then you might be able to schedule, and this is how I do it. I schedule the appointment in conjunction with the same day that they have the appointment with the doctor, and you notify the healthcare professional beforehand that you're going to want them evaluated for purposes of being able to sign a power of attorney, not a will, but just a power of attorney. And at that point, they can usually, if you do that all in the same day, then you're golden.
He doesn't have another doctor's appointment for about 5 months, and I could not get one.
You make one.
I can't. That's the soonest they can see me.
Okay.
So this is what I'm running into, is that you're telling me, here's another solution. I'm telling you that solution isn't going to work because of this. And at this point, I wonder, so far, I have been able to get the springing power of attorney accepted where I've needed it. But I think what I need is a durable power of attorney somehow. Mm-hmm. And at this point, he is capable of signing it. But if I wait 6 months, I don't know where we'll be. So you see what I'm faced with.
I do see what you're faced with.
Can I ask a related question? Can a doctor who's not their PCP do that, like a psychiatrist, neurologist, or even an emergency room doctor?
Oh, I could get an appointment with his primary care physician. I can't get an appointment with the neurologist.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be the neurologist. It could just be a primary care physician. Okay. Let me see what I can do to.
I see where you're going with this, and I might be able to, but the story I have is I took care of my sister who had Lou Gehrig's disease. And she lived in New York City, and she moved out here to New Mexico so I could take care of her full time. But her bank, she had all her account with the Chase Manhattan, with the Chase banks.
Right.
And I was not able to close her bank account or really access a lot of it without going. They told me I had to go to Colorado Springs, which was the closest branch.
Right.
And so I
That would
just
be frustrating.
I left everything the way it was until after she passed, because
Right.
I was not going to leave her for an entire day so that I could go to Colorado Springs and do paperwork.
Right.
It was,
I understand.
yeah. But I was so furious when I found out that I couldn't do anything over the telephone or electronically, but I
Right.
actually had to present myself in person.
Yeah.
So I wound up dealing with it when I went back to New York for her funeral.
Wow.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
I do have one that is more of a comment than anything else. Even if someone is on hospice, if they're on a Medicaid waiver program, you do need to call OMI. If you don't, it will trigger an investigation if someone on the Medicaid waiver dies in their own home and not in a hospital. Dealt with that with my brother. It is a federal rule, so.
And in fact, based upon what Ruth told me, I said, email me, I want that information because I'm going to put it in my when someone dies memo.
Yeah, if it's anyone who's funded by Medicaid on the waivers, you do have to go through OMI. So, and it will trigger an investigation for abuse, neglect, and fraud, automatic.
OMI is,
Office of the Medical Examiner.
okay.
I had not thought of that when my brother died. Hadn't realized it. Morgan was cremated. We had a hospice nurse practitioner in our home, and we still had to be investigated with a doctor at the foot of his bed. So
I would also make that suggestion for people who are in the res. I had to deal with that where, because you never know, honestly, and this was thankfully before the pandemic. Now it's probably worse. But even though you're in Arizona, like I said, if there was room open in Albuquerque, they're going to fly you to Albuquerque. If there's no room, they're going to fly you to Phoenix. And then because of COVID, they started going to Colorado and Utah and then other places. But if you're in the area and you're kind of constantly going back and forth, I would suggest you getting a power of attorney for both states, because it starts to get sticky, and do it sooner than later. I found that New Mexico was a little bit better and helpful, kind of like what Julie was saying about the hospital. Like the hospital, the doctors, they kind of set everything up and were like, oh, we have this for you. I didn't see Arizona really do that. It seemed like they were like, oh, well, you deal with it and just let us know what you get. So,
You know, Valerie, that brings up a point that I hadn't discussed. Give me 1 second. I'm going to turn around and pull something off mine. So there is something called DocuBank. And this is the card. This is the size of a credit card. I'm just going to let that glare cover that little tree. And what you see, if you look at that, and if you change your screen, so I'm speaker size, then you'll be able to see it better. Anyway, this document, DocuBank is something I offer to my clients who travel quite a bit. All your healthcare information can be uploaded, your financial, your healthcare power of attorney is uploaded. So say, for example, that you're hiking the Grand Canyon and you get injured and they take you out with one of those infamous helicopters to the nearest place, and they'll look for this card. They'll look to see what you have in your wallet. And this would be one of the things they would find. When they upload the information that's on this, that's in the cloud, then at that point, what they're going to do is automatically DocuBank notifies your agents, because they're automatically notified when any data is uploaded from this card.
Wow.
And so anyway, that's something, it's called DocuBank, D-O-C-U-B as in boy, A and K. And so you can certainly do that if you are traveling, or as Valerie's discussing, if you're really kind of in a triangle of places, then that way it makes it a lot, because if they feel like, because healthcare providers, you're always getting the person who's lowest on the totem pole, having to look at these things. And so as a result, they'll feel like it came from an official source if you got it from DocuBank, and you might be able to avoid some of those problems that Valerie is bringing up.
Yeah, I wish I knew about that before, because thankfully I had another, I wrangled in my family to help, because I was getting really frustrated and, just emotionally exhausted at a point. And thankfully somebody else came in and they were able to handle it a lot better than I was going to handle it, because I was really starting to get really frustrated and just so angry. And that was what was going on. So they're like, well, their primary is in, New Mexico. Well, we're trying to get their documents. And then like 2 days later, well, we can't let them go because of blah, blah, blah. And we're like, I thought you guys got the records already. And then come to find out, I don't know what happened. So instead of me getting so angry, somebody else came back. But if it were something like this, I think it would have been a lot better to at least everything is there. Because it gets very, very frustrating when you get into that. At that point.
And I've had some colleagues who've used it when they've been out of state, and it worked beautifully.
That's cool. I think one of the points that got brought up earlier about starting early, like how long things actually take, is really, really huge. The VA is the classic for this. It's going to take you probably 6 months to even get looked at. But start early, and I know I'm being Ruth the hypocrite, so Julie's going to bust my chops, but start early because it'll take longer. Don't wait till somebody.
Also, take advantage of your benefits. If you have any type of benefits, take advantage of it. Because when you do get sick, or mom gets sick, or whoever your loved one is, gets to that level, it's a lot better to have things like this to be ready. And then at the end, like I said, you might be okay right now, right? A little bit okay, you can kind of look for stuff. But when you're in it, and when you have to get these documents and find these people and call these numbers and then talk to this person again, and this person doesn't know anything, and then that keeps happening pretty much like every minute. And then, something happens to your person again, you get so frustrated, and you're just going to get so overwhelmed as well. So get those sooner than later is my biggest thing, like just what Ruth said. And at least start. It will be very emotional, I feel like, as well. Everybody goes through it. I'm sure we're all feeling it now. I know I do. But as long as you start, I think that's the whole part. And then get piece by piece as you're moving along, especially with the legal stuff. Because I know when Julie was going through some of that, I was like, oh man, can I get the recording?
For me, it seemed like, when you told me it's going to be 3 weeks before a lawyer contacts you, it was more like 3 months before the first lawyer contacted me to tell me that she wasn't available. And
We
Yeah.
try to do in my office. I have a protocol because I've gotten so busy, and there's always somebody who calls, usually within anywhere between 1 to 2 days, and takes the basic information that's needed. And that way we can do a little bit of triage if something needs immediate attention. Or it'd say, call one of these 3 lawyers that I
And I've been going through the same thing with doctors. I've been trying to get Don diagnosed with whatever was going on since June of last year. And he finally got a diagnosis in December, and he has been through 4 neurologists before he found one that could see him.
Yeah.
So it's horrific. There's no other word for it.
Yeah, it is.
It's hard. Yeah, I think COVID has really tightened the screws on anybody dealing with aging and healthcare in a really massive way. With doctors, a lot of people are leaving the field. With healthcare in general, there are a lot of people just leaving the field from CNAs on up. And I think attorneys are catching I slacked on getting a DNR until COVID. And then it's like, okay, I'm at least going to get a DNR, and I think there are a lot of folks out there in their 40s and 50s who did that.
Yeah, the DNR, as I said, if you want it, the packet that we hand out, I can send it to you electronically.
I have a question. How do you choose the right people for power of attorney?
Oh, that's a good question, Ruth.
Because they may not be your relatives, by the way.
That's right. What you're looking for, it depends on each side. If we talk about the healthcare first, when we're looking at healthcare, like I was talking about with Debbie's story, you want to have somebody who has the ability to be able to stand up on behalf of the patient and to assure that their needs are getting met as they need to be. And, don't have that people-pleasing gene that runs deep in a lot of caregivers. Ask me how I know. So anyway, that, keep in mind that you really have to be you want somebody who can stand up and do that. A lot of times, people go, oh, I'll have a nurse do it, or I'll have, I've got this, and that's fine, but make sure they meet that qualification, that they'll be a bull in a china shop, but that they will be able to advocate as they need to. On the financial side, I would say the big, huge piece is integrity. And, sometimes we think somebody has integrity and they actually don't have integrity. And so it can get kind of dicey. And so as we talked about before, Ruth, maybe it's, when you're looking around, you can use professional fiduciaries. And there are some exceptional ones here in New Mexico, even in spite of the horrible things we've heard about some of the conservators down in Albuquerque. And I don't have to mention anything. Everybody knows what I'm talking about. However, there are very many others who do the hard work. And unfortunately, because of some changes in the law as a result of what happened in Albuquerque, many of the really wonderful organizations are refusing to serve now because they don't have some of the safety nets that they had previously. When you're looking at who you can have, if you have the resources, my suggestion would be, if you don't have people who you would trust to manage your finances well, then at that point, make sure that you talk to some of the financial people that might be available, professional fiduciaries that might be available that aren't all that expensive, because they're out there. And, I keep a list and I have my clients go and interview people, because the way I put it is, I can have the first 3 on the list, But if I get 4, that's Christmas. So, because I'd like to be able to have enough that we're not forced to having to do some sort of legal action to have that person's needs met. And I'm going to leave on this, or not leave, but leave this subject on this note. Make sure that if they're listed on there, that you've actually called them and talked to them and they accept and are willing to serve if needed.
We've gone quiet. Does anybody have any questions?
I just have more of a comment for my tribal members. I know sometimes when you go through this, it is taboo not to talk about these type of things. I would just say that I think it is when you're younger, because you're not expected to have these type of issues. But when you're at a certain age, and whoever your loved one is at that age, it's appropriate. And it only helps you because we live in this world now. Now that I've definitely gone more into this, especially with my own older people, it's just more helpful for you. So just keep that in mind. I know it is a lot. Just take it bit by bit and don't think you have to get everything done tomorrow.
That's right. That is
Yeah.
true. I mean,
Yeah.
my clients, they leave with this huge homework list. And I'm like, okay, you just do it one step at a time. It's not all done and it doesn't have to be perfect. But
Before we close, are there any other last minute questions? We're very thankful to have Julie Rivers here joining us today. So much great information.
And the other is Julie will be speaking again next week, and we'll get into what happens when things get messy. How to avoid a guardianship, what a guardianship is, when you absolutely do need one, because there are times when you do need one, and basically how to deal with trouble is next week. So don't get scared away. It'll be okay.
yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Julie. We thank you for today's presentation. We look forward to you coming back next week.
I look forward to it.
And thank you all for joining. If you're not already registered for next week, the registration information's on our website. So make sure you register and so you can get the link for next class. Thank you all and have a great Tuesday.
Thank you.
Have a great day, guys. Breathe. Make sure you're breathing.
Deep breath.
Yeah, deep breaths. It'll be okay.
Bye, everyone.
You guys rock. Bye.